And you are about to see The Emperor Has No Clothes, Insecurities in Security Infrastructure. Speakers are Ben Feinstein, Jeff Jarmuck, and Dan King. Please give them a good welcome.
Thanks, everyone. First off, just wanted to thank y'all for joining us here this morning. I know there's plenty of other talks you could go to, so I'm flattered that you would join us. So just a brief introduction. My name is Ben Feinstein. I run a small research team for SecureWorks out of Atlanta, Georgia. On my left here is Jeff Jarmuck, who's one of our firewall engineers out of our Chicago operation. And over here is Daniel King, who works out of our Providence, Rhode Island office doing security engineering. So this talk is really about the discovery of a series of security vulnerabilities in security infrastructure, and talking about what are the impact of these vulnerabilities, why you should care, and making recommendations for how enterprises should better secure and consider their security infrastructure within scope for their security program. So in today's world of regulation, compliance, PCI, all these different acronyms, your security infrastructure really represents controls in the sense of an auditor who is looking for controls in that regulatory environment. So these are high-value targets. These are the systems that are keeping the bad guys out and keeping your data within your environment. Many times, particularly with firewalls or network devices, these systems are in charge of separating physical or logical zones of trust or different zones of trust within an environment. And in the case of IPS, IDS, or network devices, many times they're active or passive defensive systems. So they may be modifying traffic on the network, they may be injecting traffic on that network, or they may simply be monitoring all the traffic. And that's important to note, is that these systems, firewalls, IDS, IPS, the security infrastructure of your enterprise has a very sensitive position of trust. It is monitoring vast amounts of data crossing the network. It is in charge of enforcing controls and logical separations on that data. So when these systems fail, or when they're attacked or subverted, the impacts can be pretty severe. So just to look at, what's the outcome of an attacker successfully exploiting some of your gear, some of your infrastructure. From the least severe, it really could be a denial of service, right? An attacker may not be able to take complete control over your firewall, but he may have a bug or a vulnerability that could impact the availability of your networks, right? And for inline devices and firewalls and inline IPSs, they can completely impact your availability in a sort of denial of service situation. But getting even more severe and more serious, an attacker can gain control of device configurations and device policies in the environment. Frequently, the attacker's goal here might be to squelch alerts about the intrusion that they're committing, potentially drop the shields or reduce security controls or security data exfiltration, or open up new back channels and new firewall holes for the attacker to further impact your environment. But also, for VPN concentrators, firewalls, those devices, they hold cryptographic keys, they hold VPN keys, and sensitive credentials. So if an attacker is able to get control of these devices, they may be able to pull out your VPN keys or your cryptographic keys to your environment. That can obviously lead to eavesdropping, but also it can allow the attacker to pivot through your environment into other systems. So without further ado, I want to pass this off to Jeff Jarmuck. Jeff will be talking about some vulnerabilities we discovered in Cisco ASA Management Console and Cisco ASA itself, and also we'll be attempting a live demo of the TLS renegotiation bug, which we did not discover. That was Steve Dispenza and Marsh Ray disclosed it in November. But we have proof of concept of how you can use this against the Cisco management infrastructure.
All right, hi everybody. So the first thing we're going to talk about is an ACL bypass vulnerability in Cisco ASA. We discovered this last year and worked with Cisco to identify root cause, and they were responsive in developing a patch. So this is a patch vulnerability at this point. Throughout this, when we're talking about ASA, one point I like to highlight is that just because they're patched in release doesn't mean they're patched in production. As Ben was saying, all too often, infrastructure is treated as network infrastructure, and oftentimes, depending on network architecture, there's downtime involved to upgrade. So It's kind of a problem that these things tend to be out of date and contain known vulnerabilities. Cisco ASA, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is Cisco's flagship firewall platform. It's the successor to the popular PIX firewalls, but it has some other features that are interesting too. It's also a VPN terminator for both IPsec and SSL VPNs, and it also has IPS and content security web filtering capabilities through additional add-on modules. So it does a bit more than what people typically think of as firewalling. It seems that the trend in the industry is to ask our firewalls to do more and more, with moves toward UTM appliances and things. And I find that concerning. The more functionality you have, the more avenues of attack are available. So it's sort of a concerning trend from that perspective. So let me get to the next slide. So there's two methods that the ASA uses for deciding how to filter traffic. When there's an ACL bound to an interface, it evaluates it in top-down order. The first rule that matches is the rule that's action is taken, whether it be allowing the traffic, denying it, rejecting it. If there's no rule that matches, the traffic is processed by a default deny rule. So at the bottom of every ACL, you can think of there being a rule that drops everything, even though it's not explicitly displayed. That's the documented behavior. When there's no ACLs bound to an interface, what happens is that there's a numeric security level that determines how the traffic's handled. So traffic is allowed from an interface to any other interfaces with a lower security level. I'll explain that a little bit further. It can be a little strange to get your head around. So this is an example configuration for an ASA firewall. There's a lot of text here, but it's really fairly straightforward. There's three groups there for each of our interfaces, Ethernet 00, 01, 02. In this case, you see that Ethernet 00 is configured as our outside interface. It's named outside, and it has a security level 0, so that is the least trusted interface representing the internet. Our DMZ interface then, our inside interface is security level 100, so that's our most trusted interface, and the DMZ sits in the middle, security level 50. So what this represents is if there were no ACLs, traffic would be allowed from the internal network to go to the DMZ network or the outside network. Traffic from the DMZ would only be allowed to the outside network, and traffic coming in from the outside would be dropped regardless of destination because it's a completely untrusted interface. So that sort of explains that security level behavior. We have also a couple of access control lists here, just basically denying everything explicitly on the outside. On the inside, we've got a sample rule that's allowing HTTP and HTTPS, as well as DNS to a server that sits in the DMZ. And then the DMZ access list allows outbound SMTP and DNS traffic from our servers. So this is kind of a sample of a pretty basic configuration. So what happens when these commands are put in the wrong order? Instead of using the access group command to bind an access list after it's created, what happens if we try to bind an access list that doesn't exist? What we see is that the newer versions of ASA will give you an error message that says access group does not exist. But it seems that on some prior unknown to me version, it would accept that command, and then when you created the access list, it would process it with the normal behavior. So what happens is when you've done that on a prior version, when you upgrade to the versions that are affected by this bug, the default deny that's implicit at the end of the ACL is not applied. So the effect of that is that our default deny behavior is bypassed. Essentially what's happening is that the behavior changes from the documented behavior when an access list is bound to deny anything by default to the behavior that's a little bit less secure with the security level, the numeric security level filtering. So when you're relying on the security levels, you're allowed outbound, as we discussed earlier, from a higher security to a lower security level interface. So this bug doesn't allow inbound ACL bypass. It's only outbound ACL bypass. But that's still concerning. A lot of times you want to restrict your outbound traffic, so you're blocking things like phone home traffic for malware, botnet command and controls, possibly second stage downloaders, maybe connect back shells and those sorts of things. So this is a pretty significant, vulnerability in how the traffic filtering occurs. It's also pretty hard to identify when this is actually affecting you. There's essentially two ways to know that this is affected. The first is simply through analyzing your logs. This is actually how we first came across this. We noticed through log analysis that all of a sudden our outbound drops went to zero. Rather than dropping outbound traffic that's not allowed, we weren't seeing anything outbound being dropped in the logs, and began investigating the root cause. One thing to note here is that you'll only get these syslog messages since it's showing built connections. You have to be logging at a more verbose level in order to see those logs, and that is something that people don't commonly do. A lot of people are generally not concerned about logging traffic that's permitted. Since it's permitted, they're not concerned about it. But it's important to monitor that traffic and confirm that the permitted traffic is traffic that you meant to permit. The other way to identify that it's misbehaving is by using the built-in packet tracer on ASA. So what this allows you to do is simulate the flow of a given packet through the ASA, and it identifies what rules and what actions are taken. This can be a really helpful troubleshooting tool because it'll point you right at what's happening. And here we see in our example here an entry that indicates that the rule was allowed by an implicit rule, which again shouldn't be the behavior when there's an access list bound to the interface. You should only see this when you're relying on security levels. So it's not something that's super easy to identify when it's occurring, and that can make it even more nefarious. If you're not aware that this behavior is occurring, then obviously you're not going to take action to prevent it. So there's a few different ways to mitigate this. You can upgrade to a patch version, and there's several different versions depending on what revision you're on. Or you can add an explicit deny entry to each ACL so that you're not relying on the implicit deny. Now, this isn't something that can be triggered remotely or at will by an attacker. So it's not really a weaponizable vulnerability, but it's still important, that it points out the need to monitor what these devices are actually doing and verifying that that the behavior it's exhibiting is what you intended. You can't really tell that this is occurring by looking at the configuration. So simple, configuration auditing and strong change control and configuration control is really not sufficient. You need to actually monitor behavior. There's Ben's reminding me there's a CVE, and I thought I had that in the slides here. Well, here's Cisco's bug number that has more information. Maybe I don't have the CVE number here. I guess not. Yeah, it's in the white paper. There is a CVE entry for this issue from 2009, late 2009. So moving on, the next thing I want to talk about is some vulnerabilities I discovered in the web server, the integrated web server of ASA that supports the Adaptive Security Device Manager administration GUI. So for those of you who may never have seen it, the screenshot here is an example of what ASDM looks like. Essentially, it's a Java GUI that allows you to manage and monitor different aspects of the firewall configuration. It's meant to be a lot friendlier than the command line interface that can be kind of daunting to people when they're first learning it. You can launch this from the browser or install a package on your local machine. It runs through Java Web Start and uses HTTPS for communication back to the ASA. So I decided to look at that communication that's flowing between the client and the firewall and see exactly how that exchange is performed. What we see here is a screenshot from Burp Suite where we're proxying and renegotiating the SSL session. So we've got two SSL streams, one between this Burp machine and the ASA, and the other between the Burp machine and the client. So this allows us to see the contents of the HTTPS stream that would otherwise be encrypted and not visible to us. If you look through here, you can start to get an idea for the command flow. The first few lines there are downloading some of the Java components, the jar files and JNLP files. Further on, we see the client software after it starts up check the version of the ASA so it knows what commands are supported and how it can talk to it. And then the session that's highlighted here shows the first authenticated session. So this is after the administrators entered their username and password and connected with administrative credentials. What's interesting here, if you look at the details down at the bottom, it's using HTTP basic auth. So all that really does is base64 encode your username and password. It's pretty weak way to protect administrative credentials. It is generally over SSL, but as we'll see, there's ways to defeat that protection, and there's no further protection from the application. So just a summary of the different URLs that ASDM uses to communicate with the firewall. We've got an admin directory as well as an admin public directory, which basically store the Java files and the helper files that are given to the client. These are accessible anonymously. They're basically public directories. Our remaining directories all require authentication, and this is always done with HTTP basic auth. Every authenticated request has your username and password. So there's basically three different paths that are of interest to us. The first is the /admin/exec. This allows us to execute commands by sending the command text in the URI of the request. Admin config returns the current running configuration of the firewall. Then admin capture will allow us to view any packet captures that we've configured on the firewall. And you can also get those in PCAP format by appending PCAP. So down at the bottom of the slide here, we've got some examples of running the show ver command. You notice that the space is HTTP encoded. You can run any command that you can run on the command line by just appending it to the /exec URL. Let's see. Then the next example there is showing the download of a PCAP file for the capture name test. The next example there shows a command that's going to return the current clock, the time on the device, as well as the contents of the inside access list. Now in that example, you'll notice that we've chained two commands together. You can do this at a pretty good amount of depth. I actually haven't found a maximum number of commands that you could chain together that way. So as long as you HTTP encode your spaces and any special characters that are present, you can chain as many arbitrary commands as you'd like into a single GET request. As I mentioned, we're using HTTP basic auth for authentication. So our credentials are just base64 encoded. So in the example I had previously, this YWR is the base64 string. And as you can see, that base64 decodes to admin : super secret, which is our username and password, separated by colon. So the obvious weakness here is that if we use an SSL interception proxy like Burp, Peros, any number of those web scarab, you can rewrite, re-encrypt, decrypt and re-encrypt the session and man in the middle it. This would require that you would send a different certificate to the client since you don't have access to the private key that the ASA is using. So it is easily detectable. However, I found that oftentimes people don't, people will run self-signed certificates on their ASAs. There's generally a fairly small user base, often as few as 1 or 2 administrators that are going to be using that. Companies that don't maintain their own certificate authority don't want to go out and pay for a certificate, so they'll just use self-signed certs. With that being the case, oftentimes administrators become complacent about the SSL warnings and may just click right through. The next way that you can leverage this weakness is through cross-site request forgery. As we discussed, you can append any command you want into the URL. There's no noncing, there's no randomization of the URL. It's just /exec/command. So, there's nothing protecting us from cross-site request forgery. There's no hashing of the URIs in your authentication credentials, as digest auth might do. So there's basically nothing protecting the integrity of the URL in that request. Although to exploit cross-site request forgery, the client would have to have hit the ASA through a browser and authenticated. This isn't something that's done frequently. Most people will navigate to it, download the Java client, and then authenticate through Java. So the browser may not have cached credentials often, since those credentials aren't generally given to the browser. But if an admin user browses, using a normal web browser, the browser will cache those credentials. There's no logout mechanism. There's no age out or timeout. As long as that browser process is running, those credentials are going to be cached on the client. So there's actually a few cases where Cisco recommends you use a browser to connect to your ASA. As I said, this isn't something that's done real frequently, but there's some corner cases where it's recommended. It's the recommended way to access the ASA. One of these is for copying packet captures off the sensor. It can be a heck of a lot easier than copying it over FTP or SCP. To just pull up that URL. But as soon as you enter those credentials, that browser session's got them. Another example of a place where they recommend connecting through the browser is in pre-shared key recovery. As Ben mentioned, the ASA will have access to pre-shared keys of any IPsec VPNs that are configured on it. Cisco generally does not allow the administrator to see those keys. If you run a show run command on the command line, instead of your pre-shared key, you're going to see a series of stars. This is despite being an authorized administrator over an encrypted session. So they have an article out there that explains some ways to recover those keys in the event that they're lost and you need to replicate them. This is kind of an interesting article. The first method that they recommend is to use the more command on the command line to process your system configuration. So basically, by not going through the show command, that masking is bypassed. Cisco has kind of changed their tune on this. They're saying now that this is a bug. So they've got one article that says this can be a way to recover pre-shared keys, and then they've got a bug saying, yeah, what we told you to do in that other article, that's bug behavior. So the release notes for 8.3.1 state that that's been fixed and no longer works. I haven't actually confirmed that, but that's from the release notes. The other ways to get pre-shared key recovery are also kind of interesting. The next two are to copy it over TFTP or FTP. The thing that strikes me as odd about this is that the whole reason you need to do this is because they won't show you the pre-shared keys over an encrypted SSH session when you're authorized, but they suggest that you send them over TFTP or FTP, which are plain text protocols. I kind of don't understand how those two, those two stances can be resolved with each other. If pre-shared keys are so sensitive that we don't want to show them over an encrypted channel for risk of interception, why would we want to send them over plain text? And then their last option is to copy or download the config via HTTPS, just by connecting to the browser, your browser to the ASA with the /config directory. And that option will make your browser susceptible to cross-site request forgery. There's really, each of these methods that they describe in this article are inherently flawed, but they're recommended methods. So another way that you can exploit these weaknesses is through the SSL renegotiation vulnerability that was discovered in November. This vulnerability was discovered by Marsha Ray and Steve Dispenza of Phone Factor. It affects pretty much, in fact, I'm not aware of any SSL implementation that wasn't affected. It's a protocol design flaw, not an implementation flaw. So Cisco's far from alone in being impacted by this. There's a lot that can be said about that bug, but the short version of it is that a man in the middle can ask both endpoints to renegotiate their encryption settings. And during that process, there's a time when they can send plain text to the server, and the server will accept that and then prepend it to the request that's received encrypted from the client. So what that allows us to do is inject text into an SSL encrypted session. There's no way to decrypt data. You can't view what's going on, but you can inject arbitrary plain text at the beginning of a request. Combined with the weak authentication mechanisms that are inherent in ASA and ASDM's architecture, you can inject a URI at the beginning of the packet. The next slide here demonstrates, oops, actually, there's one more before that. Yeah, so Cisco published a security advisory rapidly after the renegotiation vulnerability was discovered. They have one security advisory covering their response to this issue across all of their products. Obviously, they had quite a few products that were affected. They also have individual bugs tracking each individual product, and they have bugs for ASA and ASDM. And there's the bug IDs up there. The problem here is that these aren't very detailed bugs, and the security advisory is kind of by its nature a little bit vague, since it's meant to apply to everything that Cisco produces. Basically, they include the text, the impact of an attack depends on the application protocol running over TLS. That's a pretty broad statement. In my mind, the impact specifically against ASDM is that an attacker can insert any arbitrary commands and take over the firewall. They can insert commands in the context of your authorized administrative session and do basically anything they want as if they were on the CLI. So here's kind of an example of how this works. At the top here, we see our original request sent by the client. And you can see it's just running a show version and some other show commands. It's not actually doing anything that would modify the configuration. And again, we see our friendly little HTTP basic auth. So then the next section there is an example of text that an attacker might want to inject into this session. So the attacker is basically injecting another GET request that says, to create a name record associating the IP 1111 with the name pwned. You could basically do anything you wanted. You could create a username. You could, clear the config. Open up modify access list to allow yourself access to other hosts that you're not supposed to have. And then you'll see there's a new line followed by thisxignore, and there's no new line following the xignore. So the effect is when the attacker's text is prepended to the actual client request, we get something that looks like the final request here. We have the attacker supplied GET command, and that xignore causes the true client initiated request to be ignored by the firewall. You'll notice that the HTTP basic auth header is still there. So we still have those valid, legitimate credentials that the client provided us, and so that's basically how this would be exploited. So there is proof of concept code for the TLS SSL renegotiation vulnerability. It was released by a group called Red Team Pen Testing out of Germany. It's up on their site as well as on ExploitDB. It does require some modifications to work with ASDM, and I've actually had some issues trying to get it working with ASDM. First of all, we would need to skip the first several requests, since there's some initial setup in downloading files, and those initial requests don't have the authentication credentials that are what we're really after. I also noticed that the connection handling on this proof of concept script was in my testing a little strange. When the server would send a FIN or a reset packet, that wasn't being passed through to the client, so the client would basically sit there and wait forever. It's not a problem when there's only one session, one connection, but Something like ASDM firing off connections rapid fire, that can be a big problem. So with that, I'm going to attempt a couple of demos. Yeah, if you don't mind. So the two things I want to demo here are the cross-site request forgery attack, and I'll kind of show an example of how that works, as well as kind of an interesting way to make it a little more weaponizable. And then I'm going to also attempt to demonstrate the SSL renegotiation vulnerability and injecting administrative commands. Now that one, I should caution, I've had some issues getting it to work in the VM because I'm basically trying to man in the middle myself. Wish me luck. We good?
You might have to run it on the other screens. You know what I'm saying?
What, like look at the
I can't
projector?
I can't close.
All right, if we can just get our... That's 2.
So it won't let me clone here.
Okay,
So you just have to
look over here. Okay, this is gonna be fun.
So
All right, so I guess we can't clone the screen, so I'm going to have to,
you can drag it.
yeah. Wow, this is gonna be fun. So we can't mirror the monitor, so I'm gonna end up trying to do this looking over my shoulder.
You can do it, Joe.
Yeah, man. Oh, wait. Okay. So what I've got here is an SSH session to this little 5505 ASA that's sitting up here. This is on the lower end of the ASA line, but it's still a pretty capable small office, home office firewall. And it only costs a couple $100. It runs the same code as all the other ASAs, so it can be a really great testing development platform. I'm going to show you here the current configuration, if I can. Sorry, this is hard to drive this way. Let me, I'll let you all look at my back so I can see. Yeah. Okay, so my SSH session got killed. I can't even see the bottom there.
Because you have 2 scroll bars.
Yeah.
Show it to the screen again.
What's that?
Can you go full screen?
Yeah, let me try that. No, full screen doesn't work on the projector. Well, this stinks. Okay, so there's the bottom. Okay, so all I really want to show from the command line is current users. So we've got 2 users. There's one that's my name, and there's one that's just admin. That's our admin super secret that we were talking about before. And what we have here is a page that demos the CSRF attack. So while everybody's looking at this lolcat, there's some script running in the background here. This script uses Jeremiah Grossman's CSS history searching. One of the tricks in weaponizing a CSRF exploit against ASA is that you have to be able to identify the name, the URL that the victim would be using to access it. People don't often have DNS names pointing to their firewalls, so they may access it by IP. So what this page does, it's got some JavaScript that basically creates a link to every IP in a given class C. I've done this for up to class Bs, and it works. It just takes a few seconds to run. It's also checking for a few names. You might have a name record called VPN or SSL VPN that points to your firewall. So we're basically searching for, searching the history by adding links to the page and then checking their color in CSS to see if they've been visited. So if we visited an IP and that IP, the URL to that IP contains asdm.jnlp, then we know that that's an ASA that's running ASDM. We still don't know that the client has connected to it, with their credentials, but we can at least be sure it's an ASA. So here you can see, it's tested a few different names and several different IP addresses. Went through the whole class C, and you can scroll down there, and it found one. So here's the URL that was cached, in my browser history, showing that I launched ASDM from this IP. This little Cisco image is just an image linked from from the ASA itself. So this is just kind of further confirmation that this is an ASA I'm looking at. This broken link here is my ASDM, my CSRF payload. So it's an image tag that just runs a command against the ASA through the HTTP request. Now, if we go back to our SSH session, you'll see now that I ran that, we've got a new user on the firewall. So just by visiting that page, that cross-site request forgery kicks in and uses my cache credentials to create an administrative user on the firewall. This was with no interaction on the client's part. As you saw, I just refreshed the job of the browser page, and this was created.
It was hard to miss, but when he just refreshed that page, it launched the CSRF, added a new user to that firewall. The CSS history trick would be what you'd use to actually target an administrator within the enterprise, because as an outsider, you may not know the URL and the IP address of that Cisco ASA. So we basically iterated through all possibilities and discovered the location of the ASA within his browser history.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So that's basically the CSRF demo. I'm going to try that TLS reneg thing. It's going to be hard without being able to see. Maybe we should just come back to that if we're not running out of time.
Yeah, we got time.
Yeah, the SSL renegotiation, I've had a little bit of issue with it on the VM, and given that I'm going to be looking over my shoulder typing, I'm not sure it's worth attempting. So I'm going to let
Yeah, if we got time, we'll try it.
Yeah.
Let's hand it off to Dan.
I'm going to let Dan continue on with his portion of the talk, and if there's time remaining at the end, we'll come back and demo that. Oh yeah, sorry.
No problem.
I'm sorry, what was that? This one, I think I've got it on 804 right now. Can you do a show ver on there maybe? Or are you trying to switch over? Yeah, I think I've got it on 804, just because some of the later versions fix the ACL bypass that I was working on as well. But essentially, I haven't looked at 8.3 yet, so I can't say for sure how 8.3 does its authorization. But every other version of ASDM, ASA that I've looked at has the basic auth issue, and that's really what makes this possible. So I believe this is present on every currently shipping version. But again, I haven't actually confirmed that on 8.3, so there's a caveat there. Go ahead. Yeah. So the question was, do the session tokens ever expire? There really is no session token. All there is this basic auth, and that's just handled by the browser. So as long as you keep your browser, your browser process running, that's going to remain cached. So the only way to clear that is to close your browser, kill the process, and restart it. When I did the CSRF attack here, I was actually using credentials that I entered this morning, a few hours before this talk, and they're still valid. So there's no timeout for that. Go ahead.
Good morning. Before I jump in, I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Dan King. I'm a security engineer with SecureWorks. In that role, I conduct network and web penetration tests and do PCI auditing for large retail chains and financial organizations. I want to quickly go over the material that I want to talk about today. The very first thing I want to talk about is the implicit trust that we place in our vendors and their products. I'm going to follow that up with speaking a little bit about McAfee's Network Security Manager, some of its features, and I'm going to segue into using cross-site scripting to completely exploit their Network Security Manager. Right after that, I want to start talking a little bit about the Cisco ASA. I'm not going to beat it too much because Jeff pretty much filled you in on all the details of that. And I want to show how using HTTP response splitting against Cisco ASA's a clientless web VPN, you can steal their user credentials. And I want to follow that up with some ideas on how we can kind of do things a little bit better. When we buy products that are designed to help us secure our networks, we naturally assume that they're secure, right? I mean, they are security products. Well, oftentimes this isn't the case. They're subject to the same issues and pitfalls as all software. They have rigorous software life cycles. They have pressure from the business to get to market, and they have demand for new features constantly. This is just a few of the many reasons why making secure software is hard, right? When we talk about new services and new features, we also have to remember that's new threats. For the more complexity a single device has, the threat surface just gets larger and larger. For example, firewalls that now do deep packet inspection, we need to make sure that they're not vulnerable to malformed packets. These devices that we're trusting implicitly are within very sensitive areas in our network. They're the gatekeepers and watchdogs of our servers and data. We need to rely on these devices, and we need to trust them. McAfee has a few products that are designed to kind of help us, secure our networks. They're IPS systems, NAC systems, HIDS systems. One of the large problems with these types of systems is management. So that's why McAfee created their Network Security Manager. Basically what it does is allows you to remote control all of their IPS systems, NACs and whatnot, and also collect all the data so that way an analyst can make sound decisions or start an investigation of possible breach. This system runs on Windows 2003, and it has a very nice web GUI and Java component, so it makes it really, really simple for administration. We at SecureWorks use this exact tool to manage sensors in our client networks. So I thought it would be a really good idea that, maybe we should test this and make sure it is what it's supposed to be doing. And it didn't take long, and I found out that the login page was vulnerable to cross-site scripting. If I had to say what web vulnerability exploited trust the most, I would have to say cross-site scripting. It's an injection-style attack that allows you to inject code, generally JavaScript, into trusted websites. And the power here really is when the user navigates to your website or whatever, they trust that content is really coming from you. And by leveraging cross-site scripting, you take advantage of that trust, and you can make that client do almost anything you want. Grab their keystrokes, their cookies, session token. They have no idea it's happening. The Network Security Manager is vulnerable to this, as I stated. The login form has two hidden form objects that are not validated at all for their content. So let's take a look on how I leverage this to take over a admin session. Since I knew the page was already vulnerable to cross-site scripting, I just needed to figure out, how to get access. So the logical step would be to phish the administrators. They're pretty gullible. I just needed to decide on what I wanted to execute. Knowing a little bit about JavaScript, I knew that the image object was a great way to smuggle data out of websites. So now the next step was to determine, well, can I get to the keys to the kingdom? Is that session data available to me? And I noticed that the web server component does not set the HTTP only flag on their session cookie, which allowed JavaScript total access to this cookie value. So Now I know I can get data out of it. Now I know I can access all the data I need. So now the next step was to just actually create the URL. And I decided to use the JavaScript encode URI function. And that will allow me to URI encode all of the data. So that way I will have no parsing issues. It just comes through. And then I just created the object. So now all I have to do is wait. And that's the beauty of it. You know, you launch an attack and you make it look as good as you can, and you just sit back and wait and watch your HTTP logs, and you just, once they click that link, you know, you'll see a log in your web server logs with the session identification. Then I take that session token, put it into the Burp suite, connect to their web interface, and bypass the login. I put together a quick video outlining this entire process. Just give me 1 second.
Escape. And then
Just minimize it.
minimize the window. It's on the desktop. You just drag the window to the left, excuse me, the right pane.
Mhm. Where'd the cursor go? Yeah.
Drag it over to the right.
I have no mouse.
You can quit it.
Do you still need that?
No, you can kill the VM. Oh, I think the VM took your mouse. Yeah, there you go. The VM captured his mouse.
You all see that okay? So there's the admin user just logging in real quick, and there's the Java interface. Narrates itself. Is the phishing attack. All admins fall for free Jonas Brothers tickets, I swear. So it's strange, he clicks the link, nothing happens. If you're not familiar with burp, this is a find and replace method on any cookie value. I'm just going to force it to that session ID. Now I'm going to navigate to the main page. Yep. Logged in with no credentials. Like I said, it's quick and easy and dirty, but it works.
So what we just saw is he used the XSS to basically capture the session credentials from the administrator that were cached, and now leverage those credentials to get an administrative session to the McAfee NSDM console.
Correct.
The question was that reflected XSS, and yes.
All right, moving on, I just want to start talking about Cisco's adaptive security appliance now. Before I said when you start putting a whole lot of features into one single appliance, it starts opening the threat surface up. And I won't beat this to death because Jeff, I think, gave a really good explanation on what these systems can do. I just want to point out that it has a really nice web interface for clientless VPN. We'll touch back with that in 2 seconds. During a recent PCI audit, I I ran into a client running one of these, and I wasn't too familiar with the web interface, so I started really banging on it. And I discovered that it was vulnerable to HTTP response splitting. You don't find it too often these days. Most web servers kind of validate this correctly. The basic gist of it is when you submit an HTTP request, you can inject a character return and line feed character into the URL. Sometimes that web server will parse that and treat those character return and line feeds just as they are. And anything following them in the URL will then be injected into HTTP headers that were going back to the client. Well, this could be a very bad thing. We don't necessarily want this to occur. This could allow an attacker to inject any arbitrary header they want. When we're using HTTP response splitting, there's one header that is more useful than any of the other ones. That's the location header. If the HTTP server is already feeding a redirect back to the client, you can change the location field. And the way this works is a lot of times you'll have a web server where you go to an authenticated page without using SSL, and it forces you to the SSL version of that site. Well, they're using a redirect there, or a 301 redirect, or a 302 redirect. So it's very common. But if the web server is vulnerable to HTTP response splitting, it'd be trivial to change the location of where that client's being redirected to. The Cisco ASA is vulnerable to this, or was vulnerable to this, I should say. When a user connects to the web VPN component to log in, the first thing that happens if they're not already using SSL is they're redirected to the secure page. An attacker could very easily use a phishing attack, send out, hey, on the IT, this is the new link, you need to go here instead. Users just follow that link. And now the web server component of the ASA will parse that link, act on the character return line feed, and inject the new location header the attacker has injected into their URL. So now the attacker has complete control over where your browser is going. So in the case that I was doing, I created an identical website to look just like the login page of this particular client. So when you follow the link, it happens so fast you don't even realize that you're not where you're supposed to be. So at this point, I had my own custom JavaScript on the page, so I could harvest their login credentials and then redirect them and send their post request back to the original ASA, so they would authenticate and not have any idea what was occurring. But now I can authenticate as them too. Not a great idea. All right, so in this slide here, we can see an evil GET request. And the first two characters that are in hex there are the character return line feed. Follow that is the new location header, and this one's not so evil because it's only going to send them to Google. This slide here shows the two location headers, and this is important because it's kind of confusing which one's going to work. Well, anytime this occurs, there can only ever be one location header. So the last one is always going to win, which is fortunate for us because when we inject it, it will always be the last one. So you can see the down on the body there, the location header is moving to Google instead of where they expect it to. So in conclusion, creating a complex system is hard. There's lots of hurdles to get software to actually function, let alone be secure. So what do? I mean, when we deploy these types of systems, we have to test them. Far too often, these security devices are deployed within networks and just never even looked at a second time. The next time you're going to be purchasing a device like this, ask a vendor for a demo. A lot of times they'll give you 60 days to make sure it works within your environments. Hit it with a vulnerability scanner. If it's got a web interface, hit it with a scanner. Learn the protocols it uses. Fuzz them. See if it'll stand up. Port scan it. There's a lot of ports in these devices that are open that really, should they be? Probably not. So I would highly recommend working with your vendors to try to figure out, a better way to do this and to really make a better product. I had the fortunate luck of working with McAfee directly and fixing their issue, and they were great to work with. They wanted to know more information. They wanted me to help validate a patch, like everything. It was fabulous. So I can't recommend enough, work with your vendors. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Ben.
Great. So we probably should have been more explicit about this, but the vulnerabilities that were presented here were disclosed in a coordinated fashion with the vendor. They are fixed in stable production releases of the software. The white paper on the CD-ROM has additional details. They have CVE numbers and product errata that would indicate which versions these issues have been fixed in. And also just to thank Omar Santos and the Cisco P-Cert, Ryan Perme of the McAfee P-Cert for the coordination that we received from them. And we have just a couple minutes for some Q questions and answers.
Bueller. Bueller.
I guess we're really good at explaining stuff. There's no questions.
Thank you.